What would you do if 200 Hell's Angels surrounded your business? Imagine looking out your window and seeing hundreds of leather-clad bikers, their massive motorcycles blocking the entire street, all staring right at your front door. Would your heart stop? Would you call the police? Would you hide? That's exactly what happened to Silas Blackwood one cold November day in 2018. But to understand why those bikers came and what happened next, you need to know who Silas is and the impossible choice he made the night before. Silas isn't just any diner owner. He's a third-generation owner of The Cornerstone, a small family diner that's been feeding the mostly black neighborhood of Northgate since 1958. His grandfather Ezekiel built it with his bare hands when most black folks couldn't even get loans from banks. His father James kept it going through riots, recessions, and every kind of trouble America threw at them. Now it's Silas's turn, and he's drowning. "Mary," Silas called to his wife one Tuesday evening as icy sleet pounded against the windows. "Did we make enough today to pay the electric bill?" Mary Blackwood, her hands dusted with flour from baking sweet potato pies, just shook her head. The worry lines around her eyes had gotten deeper lately. She didn't need to answer. They both knew. 3 missed mortgage payments, suppliers threatening to cut them off, the ancient refrigerator making scary noises that would cost thousands to fix. Money was so tight that Silas had started skipping meals himself to make sure they didn't run out of food for customers. The Cornerstone wasn't just a restaurant. For 60 years, it had been where neighbors celebrated birthdays, where couples had their first dates, where community meetings happened, where elders told stories to children. The worn wooden floors had soaked up the history of 3 generations of black life in America. "Your grandfather always said a full stomach makes a full heart," Silas's father used to tell him. "We feed people even when times are hard because that's who we are." Those words echoed in Silas's mind as he wiped down the counter for the 10th time that slow evening. Only 4 customers sat in the whole place. The storm was keeping everyone home. The cash register drawer looked empty enough to make a grown man cry. Have you ever had something precious handed down to you, something built with hope and sacrifice, and felt the crushing weight of maybe being the one who loses it? That's what kept Silas up at night. The bell above the door jangled, letting in a blast of freezing air, and there he stood, a mountain of a man, soaked to the bone, with a gray-streaked beard and a patch on his leather vest that made the room go silent. Hell's Angels, the most notorious motorcycle club in America. Mr. Henderson, who'd been coming to the Cornerstone for 30 years, quietly put down his coffee cup, left money on the table, and slipped out the back door without making eye contact. The biker's hands were shaking from the cold as he limped to the counter. His eyes weren't threatening, they were desperate. "Coffee," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "Black." Then came the words that would change everything. "My bike's out of gas a mile back. Wallet's gone. Must have dropped it somewhere in the storm." In that moment, Silas faced a choice that would test everything his family stood for. The few dollars in the register weren't even his to give away. Every bite of food had to be accounted for. Helping this stranger might be the final push that sent the Cornerstone into bankruptcy. But looking at the shivering man, Silas heard his grandfather's voice from long ago. "When you feed a stranger, you might just be feeding an angel." What Silas did next brought 200 Hell's Angels to his doorstep the very next day. What happened after that? Well, that's a story about how kindness can come back to you in ways you'd never expect. If you believe kindness matters, even when it's hard, even when you're scared or struggling yourself, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this true story will show you how one small good deed can change everything, and why we should never judge a book by its cover or a biker by his patch. The Cornerstone wasn't just a diner. It was a piece of living history. The year was 1958 when Ezekiel Blackwood, Silas's grandfather, bought the small corner building. Back then, most banks wouldn't loan money to black folks, so Ezekiel saved every penny from working double shifts at the factory for 5 years. He paid cash for the building that white business owners had abandoned as the neighborhood changed. "They say we don't belong here," Ezekiel told his wife on opening day, "but we're going to build something that will still be standing when all their doubt is long gone." The early days weren't easy. This was a time when black folks couldn't even sit at lunch counters in many places. The first brick came through the window just 3 days after opening. Then came threatening phone calls, visits from police looking for violations, and whispers that maybe the neighborhood wasn't ready for a black-owned business. But Ezekiel just replaced the glass, answered every question politely, and kept cooking the best food anyone had ever tasted. Can you imagine what it felt like when the same white officer who had hassled him for weeks finally sat down at the counter and ordered a slice of sweet potato pie? "Best damn pie I ever had," the man admitted. And something small but important changed that day. By the time Silas's father, James, took over in 1979, the Cornerstone had already become more than a place to eat. During the civil rights movement, strategy meetings happened in the back room. When the factories started closing and jobs disappeared, James let people eat on credit until they got back on their feet. When the crack epidemic hit in the 80s, the Cornerstone stayed open late, giving young people somewhere safe to gather away from the streets. If those walls could talk, they'd tell you about marriage proposals at table 7, about funeral repasts where grief turned to healing, about political arguments that changed minds, about children who grew up drinking chocolate milkshakes at the counter, who now brought their own kids for the same treat. The smell of the Cornerstone was like nowhere else. Fried chicken and buttery biscuits, coffee brewing all day long, Mary's pies cooling on the windowsill, bacon sizzling on the flat top. The sounds were just as special. The constant scrape of forks on plates, ice clinking in glasses, the bell above the door announcing each new visitor, and always, always conversation and laughter. "A community needs a gathering place," James used to say, "somewhere everybody knows they belong." By the time Silas took over in 2010, the world had changed. Big chain restaurants with flashy signs and cheap food had popped up all over. Young folks were leaving the neighborhood for better jobs downtown. The loyal customers who remained were mostly older, living on fixed incomes. They couldn't afford to pay what the food actually cost to make. Every morning, Silas arrived at 4:30 a.m. to start the day's prep work. The quiet hour before Mary arrived was when he looked over the bills, counting and recounting, trying to make numbers work that simply wouldn't add up. Last month, he'd had to let go of his only hired cook. Now it was just him, Mary, and Chloe, a neighborhood girl who waited tables part-time while going to community college. Silas had to tell her twice already that her paycheck would be late. "We should raise prices," Mary suggested one morning, kneading dough with hands that showed every year of hard work. "Nobody expects to pay 1990s prices anymore." Silas just shook his head. "Miss Gable lives on Social Security. Mr. Washington's pension barely covers his medicine. If we charge what we need to charge, who will our customers be?" This was the impossible choice Silas faced every single day. The recipes his grandfather created, passed down through 3 generations, used real ingredients, not the cheap processed stuff chain restaurants served. Quality cost money, but the people who appreciated that quality often couldn't afford it. Some days, Silas wondered if he was the one who would finally break the chain, the one who would have to close the doors, sell the building, and end what his grandfather had started. The thought made him physically sick. Yet every morning he still fired up the grill. He still greeted each customer by name. He still extended credit to those who needed it, and sometimes forgot to charge at all when he knew someone was struggling. This place isn't just about food. his father had told him on his deathbed 3 years ago. It's about dignity, about having somewhere in this world where you're always welcome, always respected. Don't you ever forget that. Silas never did forget. Not when the roof leaked and they couldn't afford repairs. Not when the health inspector threatened to shut them down until Silas's cousin, who worked construction, fixed the violations for free over a weekend. Not when the bank sent increasingly stern letters about the mortgage. The Cornerstone had fed bodies and souls for 60 years. It had witnessed history, created community, and stood as living proof that black excellence could thrive even when the odds were stacked high against it. And now, watching that massive biker sipping his coffee at the counter, Silas wondered if he was witnessing the beginning of the end, or something else entirely. Outside the Cornerstone's windows, November turned mean. What had started as a light dusting of snow that morning had transformed into something angry by evening. Wind howled down Northgate's main street, bending the old oak trees until they groaned. Sleet pounded against the diner's big front windows, like someone throwing handfuls of pebbles. The metal awning above the entrance rattled and shook. "Gonna be a bad one, mister," Washington said, looking up from his newspaper. At 82, his bones could predict weather better than any meteorologist on TV. "Reminds me of the blizzard of '78. "You say that about every storm, old man," Miss Gable replied with a smile, sipping her tea at the counter. Despite her teasing, she pulled her cardigan tighter around her thin shoulders. Only 4 customers remained in the diner. Most folks had hurried home when the weather service issued the storm warning. The lunch rush had been more of a lunch trickle, and dinner was looking even worse. Silas had already told Chloe she could leave early if she wanted. "I'm good, mister." "Blackwood," she'd said, though he noticed how she kept checking her phone, probably worried about the bus schedule. "My last class got canceled anyway." The lights flickered once, twice, and everyone froze. Then they steadied, and a collective breath was released. "Generators gassed up if we need it," Silas assured everyone, though he wasn't sure how much propane was actually left in the tank. One more expense he'd been putting off. Mary emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Maybe we should close early, Silas. Nobody's gonna come out in this." As if answering her, the old TV mounted in the corner switched from the sitcom rerun to an emergency alert. A serious-faced weatherman pointed to swirling masses of blue and purple on the radar map, advising no travel whatsoever as temperatures continue to drop. Ice accumulation of up to ½ an inch expected. Power outages likely. "Please stay indoors and—" The TV went silent as another flicker of the lights lasted longer this time, plunging the diner into darkness for 3 seconds before the electricity hummed back to life. Silas could see the worry in Mary's eyes. If they lost power for long, all the food in their refrigerators would spoil. That would be a financial hit they simply couldn't afford right now. "Let's wait another hour," he told her softly. "Then we'll close up." The storm's wail grew louder outside, a constant background soundtrack that made everyone speak a little quieter, move a little slower. Chloe wiped down already clean tables. Mr. Washington turned pages of his newspaper without really reading. The clock's tick seemed to stretch as time itself slowed down. And then it happened. The bell above the door didn't just ring. It shrieked as the door was thrown open by a violent gust of wind. Snow and ice swirled into the diner like a miniature tornado, and in the doorway stood a figure that seemed part of the storm itself. He was enormous, well over 6 feet tall and built like a brick wall. His beard was wild and matted with ice, his leather jacket crusted with frozen sleet. But what made everyone in the diner freeze wasn't his size. It was the patch clearly visible on his back as he turned to force the door closed against the wind. A grinning skull wearing a helmet, wings spreading out from behind it, and below, in bold red letters, Hell's Angels. Miss Gable made a small sound like a mouse being stepped on. Mr. Washington's newspaper crinkled as his hands tightened. The young couple in the back booth stopped mid-conversation, their eyes wide. The biker limped forward, each step heavy and deliberate. Water and melting ice dripped from him, forming dark puddles on the worn linoleum floor. His face was red from cold, his lips almost blue, but his eyes, a startling pale blue, scanned the diner with the wariness of a wounded animal. Everyone was watching Silas now, waiting to see what he would do. The air in the diner felt electric, charged with fear and uncertainty. Mr. Henderson, who'd been quietly working on a crossword puzzle at the counter, slid off his stool. Without meeting anyone's gaze, he placed a $5 bill next to his half-finished coffee and moved toward the back exit, giving the biker a wide berth. The stranger noticed, his eyes following Henderson's retreat. Something flickered across his face. Resignation, maybe, or a weary acceptance. He'd seen this reaction before. He moved to the counter, each step seeming to require tremendous effort, and lowered his massive frame onto a stool with a soft groan. Up close, Silas could see that the man was shaking, his hands mottled red and white from the cold as he pulled off his frozen gloves. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the howling wind outside and the steady drip, drip, drip of melting ice from the biker's clothes. Then, in a voice like tires on gravel, he spoke. Coffee. Black, two simple words that broke the silence but did nothing to ease the tension. Mary had retreated to the kitchen doorway. Chloe stood frozen by the register, a clean rag clutched in her hand like some kind of shield. Silas felt every eye in the place watching him, waiting for his response. This was his diner, his responsibility, and in that moment, he had to make a choice that would ripple out in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Have you ever had to choose between fear and helping someone in need? What would you do if the person asking for help was someone society had taught you to fear? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Silas's hand hovered over the coffee pot. Every instinct built from years of watching the news, hearing stories, and absorbing warnings about men like this told him to be careful, to keep his distance, to protect what little he had left. But something else pulled at him too. The biker's hands were still shaking, not from anger or drugs, but from pure cold. His breathing was labored, like each inhale hurt. And those eyes, they didn't hold threat or malice. They held exhaustion, pain, maybe even a touch of shame at having to ask for anything. Silas poured the coffee, the rich, dark liquid steaming as it filled the mug. He slid it across the counter without a word. The biker wrapped his red, raw hands around the warm ceramic, not drinking at first, just absorbing the heat. A small sigh escaped him, almost too quiet to hear. Thanks, he mumbled, his voice softer now. Silas nodded and stepped back, wiping his hands on a towel. He could feel Mary's eyes on him from the kitchen doorway, could sense Chloe's tension as she pretended to organize the silverware drawer. The man took a sip of coffee, then another. Some color began returning to his face. Outside, the storm shrieked louder, rattling the windows like it was angry at being shut out. My bike's out of gas a mile back, the biker finally said, his eyes fixed on the coffee mug. Wallet's gone. Must have dropped it somewhere in the storm. He looked up, meeting Silas's gaze directly. I'm not looking for a handout. Just a place to get warm before I figure out what to do. The words hung in the air between them. In Silas's mind, two voices began to argue. The first was his father's, practical, cautious James, who'd weathered too many hard times not to be careful. You can't feed every stray that comes along, son. Not in these times. People will take advantage. They'll bleed you dry if you let them. The second voice was older, deeper. His grandfather Ezekiel's voice, coming from somewhere further back in his memories. The measure of a man isn't what he does when it's easy. It's what he does when it costs him something. Silas found himself studying the biker's vest. The patches weren't just the Hells Angels' death's head. There were others, one that said Vietnam Veteran, another with the letters POWMIA, and the silhouette of a soldier. "You serve?" Silas asked quietly. The big man's eyes flickered with surprise. Then he nodded once. 2 tours. Long time ago. Something shifted in Silas's chest. His own father had served in Vietnam. Came back different, like so many did. "Army?" Silas asked. "Marines," the biker replied. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "They called me Grizz even back then. Before all this." He gestured vaguely at his beard, his vest. Silas made his decision then, though part of him knew it had been made the moment the man walked in. "Mary," he called softly toward the kitchen. "Plate of the Tuesday special. Extra gravy." The biker, Grizz, looked up sharply. "I told you, I can't pay." "I didn't ask you to," Silas replied evenly, meeting the man's gaze. A memory flashed in Silas's mind. Himself as a boy of 12, sitting at this very counter, watching his grandfather slide a plate toward a thin white woman with haunted eyes who'd wandered in during another winter storm decades ago. "But Grandpa," Silas had asked later, "how do you know she wasn't just trying to trick you?" Ezekiel's large hand had rested on Silas's shoulder. "Better to feed 9 tricksters than to let one hungry soul walk away from your table. A meal freely given carries power no money can buy. Remember that." Grizz stared at Silas for a long moment, something complex moving behind his eyes. "Why?" he finally asked. Silas shrugged. "No one should face a storm like this on an empty stomach." Grizz nodded slowly, like Silas had confirmed something important. Mary emerged from the kitchen, her expression carefully neutral as she placed a heaping plate in front of the biker. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes swimming in rich brown gravy, and collard greens cooked with a ham hock just like Ezekiel had taught her. Comfort food, soul food, the kind that could warm you from the inside out. "Thank you, ma'am," Grizz said, his tone softening as he addressed Mary. She seemed surprised by the politeness, giving a small nod before retreating back to the kitchen. Silas busied himself wiping down the already clean counter, trying not to think about how that plate of food represented money they couldn't spare. Tomorrow's problems would have to wait for tomorrow. Grizz ate slowly, methodically, each bite seeming to restore something in him. He didn't speak again until the plate was empty and his coffee mug drained. "You've got a good place here," he said, looking around the diner with new eyes. "Feels like somewhere a man can catch his breath." "Been in the family 60 years, Silas replied. "My grandfather built it." "You can tell," Grizz said. "Places have a feeling to them. This one's got good bones." The storm outside had eased slightly, the howling reduced to a low moan. Grizz glanced toward the windows, then back at Silas. "I need to get moving. Try to reach my brothers before this gets worse again." Silas hesitated, then reached into his back pocket for his wallet. He removed a $20 bill, money that was supposed to help pay for Chloe's bus fare home, and slid it across the counter. "For gas," he said simply. Grizz stared at the money, then at Silas. For a moment, Silas thought he might refuse. Instead, the big man reached into an inner pocket of his vest and pulled out a small folded piece of paper and a stub of pencil. He wrote something down, folded the paper, and pushed it across the counter. "My name's Frank. They call me Grizz," he said. "I don't forget a kindness." He took the 20, tucking it carefully into his vest pocket. Then he pulled his gloves back on and stood, seeming taller now, steadier. At the door, he paused and looked back. The pale blue eyes held Silas's for a long moment. "You're a good man," he said, the words carrying an unexpected weight. Then he was gone, the bell jingling as the door closed behind him. The diner seemed strangely quiet in his absence. Miss Gable and Mr. Washington exchanged glances. The young couple in the booth resumed their conversation in whispers. Chloe emerged from behind the counter, her shoulders relaxing. "You okay, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked. Silas nodded, picking up the folded paper Grizz had left. He opened it slowly. Inside was a name, Frank Grizz's Miller, and a phone number. Below it, written in surprisingly neat handwriting, were the words, "If you ever need anything, I mean it." Silas folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket, a strange feeling settling in his chest. Something between unease and hope. He couldn't have known then how important that small piece of paper would become, or what tomorrow would bring when the rumble of motorcycles would shake the very foundations of the cornerstone. Word travels fast in Northgate. By the time Silas unlocked the Cornerstone's front door at 6 a.m. the next morning, it seemed like everyone already knew about his late-night visitor. Mrs. Patterson from the beauty salon next door was waiting on the sidewalk, arms crossed tight against the cold. "Is it true?" she demanded before Silas could even say good morning. "You fed one of those Hell's Angels? Let him sit right at your counter?" Silas sighed as he flipped on the lights. "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Patterson." "Don't good morning me, Silas Blackwood. My sister's boy got mixed up with those people in Detroit. Lost everything. They're nothing but trouble." Inside, as Silas fired up the grill and started the day's first pot of coffee, the bell over the door kept ringing. But people weren't coming for breakfast. They were coming for gossip. "I heard he pulled a knife," said Mr. Cooper, though he hadn't been there. "I heard there were 3 of them," added Miss Gable, who definitely knew better. By 8 a.m., the diner was unusually full for a Wednesday morning, but almost nobody was eating. They just wanted to hear the story straight from Silas and share their opinions on his foolishness. "Your daddy wouldn't have done it," said old Reverend Walsh, shaking his head. "James was a careful man. He knew about keeping boundaries." "You don't know what my father would have done," Silas replied quietly, sliding a plate of eggs in front of the Reverend. "And your breakfast is getting cold." Only Chloe seemed to understand. "I think what you did was brave, Mr. Blackwood," she whispered while refilling coffee cups. "Scary, but right." Mary stayed quiet through it all, but Silas could read the worry in her eyes. After the morning rush slowed, she called him into the small office behind the kitchen. "This came yesterday," she said, handing him an envelope he immediately recognized, the bank's logo stamped in the corner. Inside was a letter with words that made his stomach sink. "Final notice and foreclosure proceedings." "We have until the end of the month," Mary said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. "Then we lose everything." Silas stared at the paper, the black words swimming before his eyes. 30 years of memories in this place, 3 generations of work and hope, all of it about to disappear. "I'm going to call my sister," Mary said. "Maybe she can help a little." "No," Silas shook his head firmly. "She's got her own kids to worry about. We'll figure something out." But as the day wore on, figuring something out seemed less and less possible. The food supplier called, refusing to make tomorrow's delivery unless they paid their overdue balance in full. The refrigerator made a new, alarming grinding noise, and the lunch crowd was smaller than usual. Apparently, some folks didn't want to eat at a place that welcomed Hell's Angels. By mid-afternoon, Silas sat at the counter, bills spread out before him, feeling the weight of defeat pressing down on his shoulders. The diner was empty except for Mr. Washington doing his crossword puzzle, and a young mother with a toddler in the corner booth. That's when he first felt it, a vibration, so faint at first that he thought he was imagining it, a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Mr. Washington looked up from his puzzle. "You feel that?" Silas nodded. The coffee in his cup trembled slightly. tiny ripples spreading across its surface. The vibration grew stronger. The hum became a distant rumble. The young mother looked up, alarmed. "What is that?" Outside on the street, people stopped walking. Heads turned toward the sound that was getting louder by the second. Silas walked to the window and looked down the long stretch of road that led into Northgate. What he saw made his blood run cold. In the distance, filling the entire street from curb to curb, was a dark mass moving toward them. As it came closer, the mass separated into individual shapes. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. Then scores. Then what looked like hundreds. The rumble was now a thunderous roar that rattled the windows and shook dust from the ceiling. The sound was physical, pressing against eardrums, vibrating in chest cavities. People on the sidewalks began running. Shop owners rushed to lock their doors. Someone screamed, "Mary!" Silas called, his voice nearly swallowed by the noise. "Get in the back." She appeared beside him, eyes wide as she took in the approaching swarm of bikes. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What did we do?" The young mother grabbed her child and bolted for the door, nearly colliding with Chloe, who was frozen in place, coffee pot clutched to her chest. "It's them," Chloe said, her voice barely audible over the roar. "It's the Hells Angels." The motorcycles slowed as they approached the cornerstone, spreading out to surround the building completely. Leather-clad riders with helmets and dark glasses sat astride gleaming machines, their collective gaze fixed on the diner. 200 bikers, 200 Hells Angels, and every single one of them was looking right at Silas Blackwood. "Mr. Washington moved to stand beside him at the window. "What are you going to do, son?" Silas felt a strange calm settle over him as he reached into his pocket and touched the folded piece of paper Grizz had given him the night before. He straightened his shoulders and took a deep breath. "I'm going to face them," he said. "What would you do if you were Silas? Would you hide in the back, call the police, or stand your ground? Hit that like button if you'd find the courage to face what's coming, because what happens next will change everything for the Cornerstone and teach us all something about judging books by their covers." The world outside the Cornerstone had transformed in minutes. Where there had once been a quiet neighborhood street, there was now a sea of chrome, leather, and steel. Motorcycles lined both sides of the road, their engines quieting one by one until an eerie silence fell. The men astride them remained still, like an army awaiting orders. Silas could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. His mouth had gone dry. Behind him, he heard Chloe begin to cry softly. "Maybe we should call the police," Mary whispered, clutching his arm. But Silas knew better. By the time police arrived from downtown, whatever was going to happen would already be over. And what could a few officers do against 200 Hells Angels anyway? "Get in the back," he told her gently. "Take Chloe with you." Mary shook her head, her grip on his arm tightening. "I'm not leaving you, Silas." Outside, the bikers remained on their motorcycles, their faces hidden behind dark visors and sunglasses. Many wore bandanas or scarves pulled up over their mouths against the cold. They looked inhuman, like some strange breed of modern centaur, half man, half machine. "Mr. Washington," Silas said, his voice steadier than he felt. "There's a back door through the kitchen. Take it. Go home." The old man looked at him for a long moment. "My father ran from the Klan in Mississippi," he said quietly. "I haven't run from a white man since, and I'm not starting today." Silas felt a surge of gratitude, even as fear knotted his stomach. He took a deep breath and walked to the front door of his diner. His grandfather had faced down threats to this place. His father had stood his ground during riots. Now it was his turn. As his hand touched the door handle, he said a quick prayer, not for safety, but for dignity. Whatever was coming, he would face it standing tall. The cold air hit him like a slap as he stepped outside. Up close, the wall of bikers was even more intimidating. They lined the street as far as he could see in both directions, their machines gleaming under the winter sun. The skull and wings patch was visible on every leather vest. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Silas stood on his doorstep, alone, feeling the weight of hundreds of hidden eyes upon him. Then the sea parted. A path opened down the center of the street as bikers pulled their motorcycles back, creating an aisle that led directly to the Cornerstone's door. At the far end of this pathway, a single figure dismounted from his bike and removed his helmet. Even from a distance, Silas recognized him. Grizz. But this wasn't the same desperate, freezing man from last night. Today, he stood tall and powerful, his bearing that of a commander. His beard was neatly trimmed, his leather vest adorned with more patches than the others, marks of rank and respect. Grizz began walking down the open path toward the diner. His boots struck the pavement with slow, deliberate steps that echoed in the unnatural silence. As he approached, Silas could see his face clearly. The pale blue eyes were no longer weary. They were clear, focused, intense. Behind him, Silas heard the diner door open. Mary and Chloe had come out to stand beside him. Mr. Washington stood on his other side. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Grizz stopped 10 feet away. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. Silas, the third-generation diner owner fighting to keep his family's legacy alive, and Grizz, the imposing leader of men that society had labeled as dangerous outcasts. Silas Blackwood, Grizz said, his voice carrying easily in the silence. It wasn't a question. Silas nodded once. Frank, he replied, using the man's real name. Something flickered in Grizz's eyes. Approval, perhaps. He took another step forward. Do you know why we're here? He asked. Silas felt Mary's hand slip into his. He squeezed it gently, drawing strength from her touch. I've got some ideas, he answered truthfully. None of them good. A murmur ran through the assembled bikers, like wind through tall grass. Grizz raised a hand, and it immediately stopped. Last night, Grizz said, his voice projecting to be heard by all, I was in trouble. My bike was dead. I was freezing. I had no money. He paused, looking around at his men. I came to this diner looking for warmth, nothing more. Silas stood perfectly still, waiting. Instead, Grizz continued, this man fed me. He gave me coffee. He gave me a hot meal when I couldn't pay. He gave me gas money out of his own pocket. His voice grew stronger. He treated me like a human being when others saw only the patch on my back. The silence that followed was heavy with expectation. Silas could feel tension coiling in his body, preparing for whatever came next. Grizz took another step forward. He was close enough now that Silas could see a scar running along his jawline, could smell the leather of his vest and the hint of motor oil that clung to him. My brothers and I, Grizz said, gesturing to the sea of bikers, we live by a code. It's simple. Respect is earned, loyalty is given, and debts are paid. He reached into his vest pocket. Silas felt himself tense, unsure of what might emerge, but Grizz simply pulled out a folded $20 bill, the same one Silas had given him the night before. You helped me when I was in need, Grizz said, his voice dropping so that only those closest could hear. Today, we return the favor. Then he turned, facing the assembled bikers, and his voice boomed out across the street. You helped my brother when he was in need. The code of this club is simple. An act of kindness to one is an act of kindness to all. An insult to one is an insult to all. Last night, this man, Silas Blackwood, honored one of us. Today, we honor him. He turned back to Silas, and for the first time, a small smile touched his lips. My men are hungry, he said. the words carrying a weight of meaning Silas couldn't yet comprehend. "I hope you're ready for a lunch rush." In that moment, understanding dawned on Silas like the first rays of sun after the longest night. They hadn't come for revenge. They hadn't come to threaten or destroy. They had come to pay a debt. For a moment, Silas stood frozen on the doorstep of the Cornerstone, trying to process Grizz's words. Behind him, he heard Mary's small gasp of surprise. "You mean?" Silas began. "We're hungry," Grizz said simply. "All of us." He gestured to the sea of leather-clad men behind him. Silas looked past Grizz at the hundreds of bikers lining the street. 200 hungry Hell's Angels. His small diner had 40 seats at most. As if reading his thoughts, Grizz added, "We'll take turns. We're patient men." Silas found himself nodding, his shock giving way to a different kind of panic. "We don't have enough food for everyone." "You cook what you have," Grizz replied. "We'll make it work." With that, he turned and signaled to his men. In an orderly fashion, about 20 bikers dismounted from their motorcycles and formed a line behind their leader. Silas took a deep breath and pushed open the door to his diner. "Welcome to the Cornerstone," he said, the words automatic after so many years. Grizz entered first, removing his gloves and tucking them into his belt. The others followed, each one pausing to wipe their boots on the mat, removing sunglasses or bandanas as they crossed the threshold. They moved with a surprising quietness for men of their size, finding seats at the counter and in the booths, without the usual scraping of chairs or loud conversation. Mary squeezed Silas's hand once before hurrying to the kitchen. Chloe, her eyes still wide with disbelief, grabbed a stack of menus with shaking hands. "What can we get started for you?" Silas asked, falling back on routine to carry him through his confusion. "Coffee all around," Grizz said, settling onto the same stool he'd occupied the night before. "And whatever's hot on the grill." As Silas filled coffee cups, he noticed something strange. The fear that had gripped the diner was slowly giving way to a different energy. The bikers were polite. They said please and thank you. They used napkins. They spoke in low, respectful tones. Mary appeared in the kitchen window, her face a mix of determination and worry. "We've got enough burger meat for maybe 30 patties," she said quietly. "After that, it's whatever's left from yesterday and some eggs." Grizz overheard. "Burgers are fine. Eggs are fine. Whatever you've got is fine." One of the bikers at the counter, a mountain of a man with tattoos covering his massive forearms, noticed the flickering lights above them. He frowned, looking up at the fixture. "You got electrical problems?" he asked Silas. Silas nodded. "Been that way for months. Can't afford to fix it." The big man exchanged glances with Grizz, who gave a small nod. "I'm an electrician," the tattooed biker said. "Real one with a license and everything. Let me take a look after I eat." Before Silas could respond, another biker chimed in. "That faucet in the bathroom's leaking pretty bad. I do plumbing work." A third man, older than the others with silver streaking his beard, pointed to the refrigerator that was making its now familiar grinding noise. "Sounds like a compressor issue. I fix commercial kitchen equipment." Silas stared at them, speechless. These men, these supposed outlaws that everyone feared, were offering help he desperately needed but couldn't afford. As the first round of bikers finished their meals, the most surprising thing of all began to happen. Each man would walk to the register where Chloe stood nervously. Each would pull out a crisp $100 bill for a meal that cost less than 10. "Keep the change," the first one said. "Keep the change," echoed the second. "Keep the change," said the third. The pattern continued as each biker paid. Soon, a small mountain of $100 bills was growing beside the register. Chloe looked at Silas, her eyes wide with disbelief. He could only shake his head, equally stunned. As the first group left, a second wave of hungry bikers entered, just as orderly, just as respectful. And while they ate, the tattooed electrician was up on a stepladder, his leather vest set aside, working on the wiring above the counter. In the bathroom, the plumber had shut off the water and was replacing the worn-out washer that had been dripping for months. In the kitchen, the older biker had the refrigerator pulled out from the wall, tools spread around him as he worked on the compressor. Outside, a small crowd of neighborhood residents had gathered across the street, watching in cautious amazement as group after group of Hell's Angels entered the diner, ate, paid, and left, without a single raised voice or moment of trouble. By the third hour, the atmosphere in the Cornerstone had transformed completely. Mary was laughing as she cooked, having enlisted 2 bikers with kitchen experience to help her when the food began running low. One had rushed to the grocery store, returning with bags of supplies he'd paid for himself. Chloe moved confidently between tables now, chatting with the leather-clad men who called her Miss, and left additional tips beside their plates. Even Mr. Washington was engaged in an animated conversation about classic motorcycles with a group of older bikers who'd served in the same war he had. The electrician finished his work, flipping a switch that made the lights shine steadier and brighter than they had in years. "Fix the short," he explained. "Also rewired that junction box that was about to cause you a fire." The plumber emerged from the bathroom, wiping his hands. "Fix the leak, replaced the flush valve that was going bad, and tightened up those loose floor tiles while I was at it." In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed with a new, healthy rhythm. "Compressor's good for another 5 years at least," the repairman declared. "Also cleaned out those coils. That was half your problem right there." Silas stood in the center of his diner, watching as these strangers, these men he'd been taught to fear, fixed problems he'd been worried about for months. Around him, the cash register continued to fill with $100 bills as each biker insisted on the same 4 words: "Keep the change, brother." The diner that had been on the verge of foreclosure that morning was now buzzing with life, filled with the smell of cooking food, the sound of conversation, and a growing pile of money that represented not just payment for meals, but a profound form of respect. If this story has surprised you so far, if you're amazed at how quickly judgments can be overturned and stereotypes shattered, hit that like button right now, because the lesson of the Cornerstone is just beginning to unfold, and it's one that might change how you see the strangers who cross your path tomorrow. Across the street from the Cornerstone, a small crowd of neighborhood residents had gathered. They stood in tight clusters, talking in hushed voices, their eyes never leaving the parade of motorcycles and leather-clad men flowing in and out of the diner. "I don't understand, Mrs." Patterson whispered to Reverend Walsh. "Why aren't they tearing the place apart?" "Maybe they're waiting for something," the Reverend replied, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "This doesn't make sense." As the afternoon wore on, the crowd grew larger. People called friends and family, describing the unbelievable scene unfolding at Silas's diner. Cars slowed as they passed, drivers craning their necks to see the wall of motorcycles. Some even parked a block away and walked back, drawn by a mixture of fear and fascination. Inside the Cornerstone, Silas was too busy to worry about the onlookers. He moved between tables, pouring coffee, taking orders, and watching in amazement as his diner transformed. The refrigerator hummed smoothly now. The lights shone bright and steady. Even the wobbly table in the corner had been fixed by a biker who'd produced tools from his saddlebag and shimmed the legs so nobody's coffee would spill. The first neighborhood resident brave enough to enter was, surprisingly, old Miss Jenkins, who had lived in Northgate for all of her 82 years. She pushed open the door with her cane, her white hair perfectly styled despite the wind outside, and stood blinking at the scene before her. The diner fell quiet as bikers turned to look at the tiny woman framed in the doorway. "Is Silas here?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. "Miss Jenkins!" Silas hurried over. "Everything's fine. These men are customers." She peered up at him through thick glasses. "Well, I'm a customer too. It's Wednesday. I always have the meatloaf special on Wednesday." A large biker at the counter stood up. "Ma'am, please take my seat." Miss Jenkins looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you, young man. My hips aren't what they used to be." Just like that, the ice was broken. The biker helped Miss Jenkins onto the stool, carefully placing her cane against the counter where she could reach it. Silas brought her usual iced tea with lemon. "Your regular table's taken right now," he explained apologetically. "I can see that," she replied, looking around at the leather-clad men filling every booth. "Quite a crowd today." The biker who'd given up his seat remained standing nearby. "I'm Bobby," he introduced himself. "From Kentucky, originally." "I'm Margaret Jenkins," she replied. "From right here, all my life." "You've probably seen this place change a lot then," Bobby said. And just like that, they were talking. Miss Jenkins telling stories about Northgate in the 1950s, about Silas's grandfather, and how he'd stood up to the bank that didn't want to give a black man a business loan. Bobby listened, genuinely interested, occasionally asking questions that showed he was really hearing her. Outside, the gathered crowd watched through the windows as Miss Jenkins chatted comfortably with a Hell's Angel twice her size. The sight was so unexpected, so contrary to everything they'd assumed would happen, that it broke through their fear. "If Miss Jenkins is okay in there." "Mrs. Patterson said uncertainly. "She always did have more guts than sense," Reverend Walsh replied, but there was a hint of admiration in his voice. One by one, cautiously, other neighborhood residents began to enter the diner. Mr. Cooper from the hardware store, the Lewis family who lived above the laundromat, Carlos and his wife from the bodega on the corner. Each entered nervously, but was greeted with nods of respect from the bikers, many of whom gave up their seats or made room at their tables. Silas watched in wonder as his regular customers and the Hell's Angels began to talk. Really talk, not just polite small talk, but actual conversations. Carlos was deep in discussion with a biker about classic Harley engines. Mrs. Lewis discovered that one of the bikers had a daughter the same age as hers. They were comparing notes on dealing with teenage attitude. Mr. Cooper was showing another man pictures of a motorcycle he'd owned in his younger days. At one table, a young biker with a fresh scar on his face was talking to Reverend Walsh. "I didn't expect to see a preacher in here," the biker said. "I didn't expect to be sitting with a Hell's Angel," the Reverend admitted. "But my father taught me never to judge a book by its cover." "My old man taught me the same thing," the biker replied. "Before he went to prison, that's when I joined the club. They became the family I needed." The Reverend nodded slowly. "Family comes in many forms." "Yes, sir, it does." In another corner, Miss Gable had returned to the diner and found herself sharing a booth with 3 bikers. Her initial terror had given way to curiosity as they told her about their charity work. "We do a toy run every Christmas," explained a gray-haired biker with weathered skin. "Last year we delivered presents to over 500 kids in foster care." "But the news only shows the bad things," Miss Gable said, shaking her head. "That's how it goes," the biker shrugged. "People see the patch, they make assumptions." "I made assumptions," she admitted. "I'm sorry for that." The biker smiled. "No need to apologize, ma'am. We're used to it." By late afternoon, the Cornerstone had become something it had never been before, a true meeting ground where different worlds collided and found common humanity. Bikers shared stories of cross-country rides while neighborhood folks talked about growing up in Northgate. They discovered shared military service, shared worries about the economy, shared love of good food and classic cars, and children who wouldn't listen to their parents. Mary emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and stood beside Silas at the counter. "Look at this," she said softly, gesturing to the diner filled with conversation and unlikely connections. Silas nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "This is what my grandfather dreamed of, a place where everyone belongs." "He would be so proud," Mary said, slipping her hand into his. "So proud of you." Outside, the winter sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. But inside the Cornerstone, there was only warmth and light, and the sound of barriers breaking down, one conversation at a time. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Grizz checked his watch and caught the eye of several of his men. A silent communication passed between them. It was time to go. The bikers began wrapping up conversations, shaking hands with newfound neighborhood friends, and gathering their gloves and helmets. "We've got a long ride ahead," Grizz explained to Silas. "Winter nights get cold quick." Silas nodded, still stunned by everything that had happened. The diner had been completely transformed in just a few hours. Not just the repairs, though those were significant, but the feeling of the place, the energy, the hope that now filled every corner. Mary approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "Let me pack some food for your ride," she told Grizz. "Some of the boys made extra sandwiches in the kitchen." "That would be mighty kind, ma'am," Grizz replied with a respectful nod. As Mary went to prepare the food, Silas walked Grizz to the register where Chloe stood guard over the small mountain of cash. The young waitress's eyes were still wide with disbelief as she looked down at the pile of $100 bills. "I counted it 3 times, mister." "Blackwood," she whispered. "It's over $20,000. Silas felt his knees go weak. $20,000. More money than the Cornerstone made in 6 months. Enough to pay off the bank, the suppliers, fix the roof, and still have something left over. "This is too much," Silas said, turning to Grizz. "I can't accept all this." Grizz's weathered face softened. Every one of those bills was given freely, for good food and better company. "It's not charity, Silas. It's appreciation." "But my men are proud," Grizz continued. "They don't like owing debts. Last night, you saw a man in need, not a patch on a vest. You showed respect when most people show fear." He gestured to the stacks of money. "This isn't about the money. It's about honor." Outside, the bikers had started their motorcycles, the combined rumble making the windows vibrate gently. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across Northgate's main street. The crowd of onlookers had grown, no longer fearful, but watching in amazement as the day's most unlikely story prepared to conclude. Mary returned with several large paper bags filled with sandwiches, which she handed to Grizz. "Thank you for today," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved our diner." "Your husband saved me first," Grizz replied simply. "That's how it works." The 3 of them walked to the door together. On the threshold, Grizz stopped and turned to face Silas one last time. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small card, which he pressed into Silas's hand. "This has my personal number," he said. "Not the one I gave you last night. If you ever need anything at all, you call. The Hells Angels don't forget their friends." Silas looked down at the card, then back at the man who had brought such unexpected blessing to his family's legacy. "I don't know how to thank you," Silas said. "You already did," Grizz replied. "Last night when it mattered most." He extended his hand. Silas took it, feeling the strength in the biker's grip. It wasn't just a handshake. It was a bond. A connection between 2 worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart just 24 hours earlier. Grizz walked out into the cold evening air, mounting his motorcycle at the head of the formation. He pulled on his gloves, adjusted his helmet, and then turned back toward the diner where Silas and Mary stood in the doorway. He raised his hand in a final salute, as 200 Hell's Angels gunned their engines. The sound was deafening, a roar that seemed to shake the very foundation of the street. It wasn't threatening now, it was triumphant, a celebration, a farewell that said more than words ever could. With Grizz leading, the bikers pulled away in perfect formation, their taillights glowing red in the gathering darkness, like a river of fire flowing away from the cornerstone. Silas and Mary stood watching until the last motorcycle disappeared around the corner and the rumble faded into the distance. Then, hand in hand, they walked back inside their diner. The remaining customers, a mix of regulars and neighborhood folks who had ventured in during the day, broke into spontaneous applause as they entered. Chloe was crying happy tears. Mr. Washington raised his coffee mug in a toast. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Silas and Mary sat at the counter counting the money for the fourth time, still unable to believe it was real. $23,600, Mary said, her voice hushed with awe. Silas, we can pay everything off. We can fix the roof. We can even update some of the kitchen equipment. Silas nodded, his throat too tight for words. His eyes swept across the diner his grandfather had built. The lights shone bright and steady. The refrigerator hummed with a healthy rhythm. Even the old floorboards seemed to gleam with new life. Your grandfather used to say that when you feed a stranger, you might be feeding an angel, Mary said softly, resting her head on his shoulder. Silas smiled, thinking of Grizz and his leather-clad army. I don't think Grandpa had Hell's Angels in mind, he replied. Mary laughed. Maybe not, but I bet he's smiling down right now. Outside, snow began to fall softly on Northgate, covering the tire tracks left by 200 motorcycles that had come not to destroy, but to repay a simple act of kindness in ways no one could have imagined. By the next morning, the story of what happened at the Cornerstone had spread through Northgate like wildfire. People who hadn't set foot in the diner for years showed up for breakfast, eager to see the place where 200 Hell's Angels had come to repay a kindness. Is it true they fixed your refrigerator? Asked Mrs. Williams, who taught third grade at the local elementary school. And the wiring? Added her husband. And left $20,000? Whispered someone else. Silas found himself telling the story over and over. How Grizz had stumbled in during the storm. How he'd fed him without question. How the bikers had returned not for trouble, but to show appreciation in the most unexpected way. By lunchtime, there was a line out the door. Something the Cornerstone hadn't seen in decades. People from neighboring communities drove in, having heard the story from friends or relatives. A reporter from the local newspaper showed up, notepad in hand, asking for details. It's just good business, Silas told the reporter modestly. Treat people right, and they'll treat you right back. But he knew it was more than that, much more. The story appeared in the next day's paper with the headline, Kindness Repaid, Hell's Angels Save Local Diner. There was a photo of Silas and Mary standing in front of the Cornerstone, smiling like they hadn't smiled in years. That weekend, a news crew from the city showed up. Then another. The story was picked up by a national network, then shared online where it spread even further. Suddenly, the Cornerstone wasn't just a struggling neighborhood diner. It was a symbol of something powerful. How a simple act of kindness could bridge worlds that seemed impossibly far apart. With the money from the bikers, Silas and Mary paid off their debts and made long overdue improvements. They hired back their cook and added 2 more waitresses to handle the increased business. They expanded the menu, though they kept the Tuesday meatloaf special exactly as it had always been. That's what saved us, Silas would say with a laugh. Can't mess with what works. 3 weeks after the bikers' visit, a familiar rumble sounded outside the diner. Not 200 motorcycles this time, just one. Grizz walked in alone, removing his helmet and nodding to the customers who all fell silent, watching the legendary figure they'd heard so much about. "Just passing through," he told Silas, taking a seat at the counter. "Thought I'd stop for some of Mary's pie." It became a pattern. Every few weeks, Grizz would appear, sometimes alone, sometimes with a few brothers. Occasionally, other Hell's Angels would stop by when their travels brought them near Northgate. They were always respectful, always paid well, and always left the Cornerstone better than they found it. One day, a biker named Wheels showed up with his teenage son. "Wanted him to see this place," Wheels explained to Silas. "Wanted him to understand what it means to judge fair." Silas nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. He seated them at his best table and brought the boy a chocolate milkshake on the house. The most surprising change wasn't in the Cornerstone's finances, though those had improved dramatically. It was in the community itself. People who had clutched their purses tighter when a motorcycle rumbled down the street now smiled and waved. Reverend Walsh gave a sermon about finding angels in unexpected places that had his congregation talking for weeks. Miss Gable, who had been among the first to fear the bikers, now proudly showed visitors a leather keychain with the Hell's Angels logo that one of them had given her. "Taught me something important that day," she would say, "about looking past appearances to see the person inside." Even Mrs. Patterson, who had been so quick to judge, had changed her tune. "Goes to show you never can tell about people," she'd say to anyone who would listen. "Those bikers did more good in one day than some church folks do in a year." For Silas, the lessons went deeper. 6 months after that fateful day, he sat with Mary at their usual table after closing time, drinking coffee and talking about how much had changed. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said. "What would have happened if I'd turned Grizz away that night?" Mary reached across the table for his hand. "But you didn't. That's who you are, Silas. That's who your father raised you to be, who your grandfather was." "I almost did, though," he admitted. "I was scared. I saw the patch, not the man. But in the end, you saw what mattered," Mary said, "and so did he." The bell over the door jingled, even though Silas was sure he'd locked up. He turned to see Chloe slipping in, waving an envelope. "My acceptance letter came!" she cried, rushing to their table. "I got the scholarship." They had used some of the money from the bikers to create a small college fund for Chloe. She would be the first in her family to attend university. The Cornerstone Scholarship, Silas had named it, for people who bring different worlds together. Watching Chloe dance around the diner in joy, Silas thought about how far they'd all come. The diner that had been weeks away from closing was now thriving. The community that had been divided by fear was now stronger, and it had all started with a simple cup of coffee offered to a man in need. On the wall near the register hung a framed photograph, Silas and Grizz standing side by side in front of the Cornerstone, both smiling. Underneath, a small plaque read, "Kindness comes back around." Customers often stopped to look at that photo, and Silas would tell them the story, how a black diner owner and a Hell's Angel found common ground in a simple act of human decency, how 200 bikers transformed not just a struggling business, but an entire community's way of thinking, how judging books by their covers robs us of the chance to read amazing stories. "The funny thing is," Silas would tell them, "I thought I was just giving a man a meal. I never expected it would change everything." But it had. One small kindness, offered without expectation of return, had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted, touching hundreds of lives and creating connections that crossed every barrier of race, background, and appearance. If this story touched your heart, If it made you think twice about judging others, or reminded you of the power one simple act of kindness can have, share it now. And tell us in the comments about an act of kindness that changed your life. Because sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest ripples, and you never know how far those ripples might reach. One meal, one cup of coffee, one moment of seeing a person instead of a stereotype. That's all it took to change everything for Silas Blackwood and the Cornerstone Diner. What started as a simple act of kindness during a winter storm became the miracle that saved a family's legacy and transformed an entire community. We often hear, "Don't judge a book by its cover," but how many of us truly live by those words? The truth is, the most unexpected people can become our greatest blessings, if we're brave enough to look past labels and see the humanity we all share. The story of Silas and the Hells Angels reminds us that kindness is never wasted. It may not always come back in the form of 200 bikers with $100 bills, but it always returns somehow, in ways that matter. If this story touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss another true American story of courage, connection, and unexpected friendship. And make sure to tune in next week when we share the incredible journey of a homeless veteran who saved a small town from disaster and found his way home in the process. Remember, the most powerful stories aren't just the ones we tell, they're the ones we live every day.